The traditional interpretation of prehistoric geoglyphs and cave paintings has long been dominated by symbolic, ritualistic, or cosmological frameworks. These interpretations often impose unjustified cultural interpretations and fail to account for the persistent geometric consistency, the spatial repetition, and the embedded formal regularities observed across sites ranging from the Nazca Plateau to the Mississippi Valley, from European caves to Australian rock shelters. What we propose is a reframing of these ancient visual systems not as representations of mythology or ritual in abstraction, but as functional geospatial tools, a systematic practice of embodied cartography anchored in physical movement, proportion, and iterative communal recording. This is not speculative. It is logically consistent with both the structural features of the artifacts and with the constraints of pre-literate knowledge transmission. The large-scale figures, whether earthen effigies or desert-lined geoglyphs, were created to be walked, not merely viewed. The act of walking a figure was the primary mechanism of instruction and internalization. It enabled practitioners to memorize geometric proportions through bodily repetition, understand scalable form. While segment lengths varied with figure size, the turning angles remained invariant. This preserved the structural relationships across scales. So, practice projection involved, reconstructing the form at different sizes and orientations across all sorts of varied terrain. In doing this, individuals developed the capacity to lay out spatially accurate representations, independently of the original template. Each walked figure acted as a kind of kinesthetic template. Individuals would mark specific reference points they encountered during the walk, maybe natural features, distances, or any orientation changes, and these would be recorded after the fact, often on cave walls or other fixed media. The process would get repeated by others, starting from different initial reference points, but using the same procedural logic. Over time, these individual reconstructions would accumulate as superimposed, angularly varied figures. To modern observers, this sort of thing results in cave paintings that look like overlapping animal outlines, at all sorts of scales and orientations, and they're often described as symbolic, shamanic, or just plain aesthetic. But when you interpret them through this model, they actually reveal themselves as composite cartographic maps, the convergence of multiple recorded traversals of a physical terrain. So, the variation in scale actually corresponds to different walking spans and, the variation in orientation reflects different reference alignments. Crucially, the preservation of structural proportions across these variations really indicates intentional geometric control, not just symbolic improvisation. One of the major interpretive errors in contemporary analysis, honestly, stems from assumptions about orientation. These prehistoric mapping systems don't default to north-up like we see in modern cartography. Instead, figures are frequently oriented with either the sunrise, east, or the sunset, west, as up, depending on, the cultural or situational context of the original traversal. Correcting for this and rotating the figures appropriately often reveals striking geographic correspondence with real-world landforms. Valleys, rivers, coastlines, and terrain contours appear not as abstracted symbols, but as faithfully rendered, albeit stylized representations preserved through accumulated communal spatial memory. This theory is not closed, nor does it rely on esoteric knowledge. It is open to empirical testing. So first, you'll want to select high-resolution imagery of known prehistoric cave paintings, or, large-scale geoglyphs. Next, identify figures that appear repeated or superimposed with a consistent structure. Then, it's important to test multiple orientations, especially with east or west as the vertical axis. After that, overlay those rotated figures against real topography using satellite imagery or topographic maps. Look for alignment between the contours of the figures and features of the landscape, particularly curvature, branching, and aspect ratios. And finally, validate across independent regions to identify recurrence of technique and proportional logic. This process actually enables any competent analyst to test the theory directly. Accepting this interpretive framework, well, it really repositions much of what we've categorized as prehistoric art into a category that's more appropriately termed applied spatial cognition. These weren't static symbols. They were operational diagrams used for training, communication, and collective memory. So, the figures encoded knowledge about terrain, orientation, and relative location, all embedded in a method of reproducible geospatial instruction. Moreover, the social dimension is essential. By engaging in this system, walking the figure, learning its proportions, marking reference points, communities participated in a shared epistemology. The cave wall did not preserve isolated visions, it aggregated navigational histories. In effect, these walls are not representations. They are archives of distributed geospatial experience. In summary, this theory positions prehistoric geoglyphs and cave paintings as a precise, procedural knowledge system based on embodied spatial training, collective cartographic recording, and intentional iterative reconstruction. Far from mystical or decorative, these figures are components of a sophisticated cognitive infrastructure built to record, transmit, and refine geographic knowledge across generations. This is not speculative. It is testable, replicable, and explanatory, and it resolves long-standing contradictions left open by symbolic or ritual interpretations. He who has ears, let him hear.